Foul man thing, bow before the Dark Lord.
Damn it! Although we are able to match these foul creatures, they outnumber us!
You are nothing before the Dark Lord. Surrender or perish!
What will we do?
I will take care of that.
What?
Away, foul creature! These middlemen are under the protection of the High Men of Numenor.
Wait, what in the name of an Easterling's nutsack is a high man?
Oh, well, we're like the middlemen, but blessed by the Valar.
Wait, Valar? Like the angels?
Yes.
Okay, what blessing exactly do you get?
Oh, well, we're all 7 foot tall.
What?
We're all super strong. Yes, able to cleave orcs in two.
What?
We all live to 300 years.
What?
We're immune to sickness, disease, and corruptions of all forms, whether it be magical or physical.
Okay, pretty busted, not gonna lie. Hey, but at least you don't have anything stupid like bows that can shoot meter-long arrows or something. You have bows that can shoot meter-long arrows, don't you?
Yes, and they're also made of hollow steel.
Okay, that's just bullshit!
Salutations Rangers, General Bradley 101 back again with some more lore. And in today's video, boys and gals, we are taking our first look into what is one of the greatest pieces of literary works and the greatest fantasy literary work ever created. That being the tale of he who would strive to be Lord of the 20 Rings, and the world in which he would plot and scheme. That of Arda, written by he who had within him a gift unparalleled, and who, with hope in his breast, gave this hope unto men, but kept none for himself. For his wish was that all who would read his work would be reminded of the goodness and strength in all. Commander of Her Majesty's Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien.
So, if you couldn't really figure it out, I'm a pretty big Lord of the Rings fan. Hashtag Numenor for life. Gondor is Pog. Very good. Would bang an elf. You know I would.
Hold up!
Also, if you don't like Lord of the Rings, seek help, because, you're wrong.
So, when talking about the Lord of the Rings, there are so many topics, and all of them are just great. Yet, I want to talk about something that most people have forgotten. For while Tolkien created the modern genre of fantasy, with all the famous tropes for races and civilizations coming from him, modern fantasy has for one reason or another seemingly left one of these original creations out. And in my opinion, it has left a gaping hole in the fantasy genre. And due to us forgetting this tale, we also forgot the lesson it taught, which for we as humanity was again, in my opinion, the most important lesson Mr. Tolkien had for us. And that people, that civilization, that story, and the lesson they are, is the race of the High Men, the First Men. The first, and to my knowledge, the last example, being the sons of the Edain, and the fathers of the Dunedain, the Sea Kings, the princely race of men, the Ship Kings, the Blessed Men, the mightiest civilization Arda had ever seen, the High Men of Numenor. And to understand how, and more importantly why, this forgotten fantasy race is in fact Tolkien's forgotten hope for humanity, we must learn from their story. And to learn from their story, we must know it. And where else would one begin about a people than the history therein? Before we can start with the Numenorian glory of the Second Age, we must first go to that of the First Age and the Wars of Morgoth. So, for those of you who don't know, Tolkien divided his history into ages, with each age being a couple thousand years. For reference, the actual story of Lord of the Rings is in the latter part of the Third Age. So, men awaken in the beginning of the First Age, in the most eastern land of Arda, known as Hildorian. Melkor, later known as Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, Morgoth was the chiefest and greatest of the 14 Ainur. The Ainur were essentially Tolkien's version's angels, and these angels were created by Eru Ilúvatar, the god of Arda, Tolkien's version of God. Morgoth would then rebel against Eru, thus him becoming Tolkien's version of Satan in all but name. During this time, Morgoth would wage several wars against the Valar, lesser Ainur, who came to inhabit the western continent of Arda, that being Valinor. It was during this time that he would seek to corrupt the second children of Eru Ilúvatar, that being men. The first children of Eru being the elves, who came to inhabit both the eastern and western continents. This then caused the race of men to split into the Eastlings, who either came under Melkor's influence or rather stayed in the east to fend off his influence, and the Entanatari, who decided to travel west in search of the mythical land of Undying Light, aka Valinor. And though they would not reach the sacred continent, they would change history as we know it. For Morgoth had fought the elves and the Valar once before, and he would lose. He was then pardoned. However, he would then find his opportunity to start another war, this time over the Silmarils. Magical gemstones of great power forged by the mighty elf Feanor, which became a series of wars known as the Wars of the Great Jewels, which lasted from the Year of the Trees 1497 into the 587th year of the Fifth Age. The Entanatari, which became known as the Edain, had three distinct houses, that of Bjorn, Halath, and Hador. They would end up settling all over the west, becoming the ancestors of Gondor, Rohan, the Dunlendings, Lake Town, every single man in the west. But these three houses would pledge fealty to that of the elves, and they would join in the fight against Morgoth during the last 30 years of the war, which became known as the War of Wrath. And lo, they paid a terrible price. For they had not the skill of the elves, nor the arms of the dwarves, nor the wrathful evil of the servants of Morgoth. Yet they had spirit, a spirit unbreakable, and a defiance that shocked all who foresaw it. And thus did the war end, with the Valar leading the final assault on Morgoth. And as for the men who fought so valiantly under the Eldar, they were given a reward by the Valar, that being twofold. 1. An increase in vitality, lifespan, wisdom, and ability. And 2. An island paradise, in the shape of a star, for the men of the Edain and a small contingent of the Druidain. Shorter, more primitive humans, but still had a kinship with the humans as they were also children of Eru. For both of them were guided there by the Star of Erendil, the grandfather of Elrond and Elros, twin brothers of noble lineage and even nobler deeds. And this land that would be raised from the sea itself would be known as Elena or Numenor, and thus the High Men of Numenor were created. Over the next 50 years, the men of the Edain began migrating over to their new island home under the leadership and guidance of their first king, Elros, brother of Elrond. With the both of them being descendants of both elven and human partnerships, they were given a choice whether they would live as men and inherit the gift of death, or have the immortal life of the Eldar, with Elrond, as you know, choosing the life of an elf, whereas his brother, Elros, chose the life of a man, taking up the Quenya title of Tar Minyotor, or the First High Lord, and he would rule Numenor for 442 years, living to the age of 500, before deciding to die in 442 of the Second Age. And no, that's not a joke, but we'll touch upon that later. He was then succeeded by his son, Tar Valdemir, but realizing that he himself was too advanced in age to then also abdicated after only ruling for a single year in 443. He abdicated in favor of his son, Tar Amandil, who would rule until the year 590, before abdicating for his son, Tar Elendil, who would rule until the year 740. It was during this time that the people of Numenor thrived, becoming expert craftsmen, horsemen, and most importantly seafarers, with their only restriction being the ban of the Valar, which stated that they could not sail so west that they could no longer see their own shore with their eyes. Thus, the Numenorians began to sail eastward, and in the year 600, they would reach the shores of Middle-earth, and they would meet the elves of Lindon, and became staunch friends and allies with the High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad. In addition to this, they became the protectors and teachers of the middlemen, those who did not cross the Blue Mountains into Eregion, for they saw in them a kinship and a friendship, realizing that they were in fact of the same people, and they sought to raise them up as they had by the Valar before them. The only exception to this was the ancestors of the Dunlendings, who were less advanced, primitive, and for the main reason, they were very hostile. As when the Numenorians began settling around the shores of what would eventually be Gondor, they began taking lumber to build ships amongst other things. The ancestors of the Dunlendings then made war upon them, or rather they tried to. This was like a random Bronze Age tribe fighting the Eastern Romans at their zenith. Needless to say, they were soon chased off, to where they would reside in the present day. In addition to this, the elves of Valar would make strong ties of kinship, trade, scholarly, and artistic ties with the High Men, gifting them many great things, such as knowledge, lore, great objects of might and power, but also plants, such as fruits, crops, and most importantly, a seedling from Celebron, which itself was a seedling from Telperion, the Silver Tree of Light, which would eventually become the White Tree of Nimloth, which is the ancestor of the White Tree of Gondor. It was also during this time that the Lordship of Andunier, the greatest port city of Numenor, was given to a cadet branch of the royal family, and here, the nobility of faith of the High Men would prove most strong. Thus did the High Men continue to explore, adapt, craft, and trade, and live prosperous and peaceful lives, being true exemplars of every noble creed and virtue that there was. However, their peace would be soon disturbed, as in the year 822 of the Second Age, Tar-Menadul receives a warning and a plea for future aid from High King Gil-galad, warning of a dark shadow seeking to devour the earth, for Sauron had re-emerged. Taking this plea to heart, Tar-Menadul would then abdicate to his son, and the Numenorians would begin expanding upon building arms and armories, preparing for war, though neither Tar-Menadul nor his son would live to see the need for this aid. We then continue on until Tar-Aldarion. Ever since the time of Tar-Miniatur, Numenor had been ruled in the style of that of the elves, that being agnatic primogenitor, or the first eldest male child would inherit the crown. This was until, however, we have Tar-Aldarion, who changed the laws of succession from agnatic to cognatic primogeniture, from eldest male to eldest child, regardless of sex, for he had become estranged with his wife, and thus he only had one heir, his daughter, Tar-Ankalime. This was accepted, and she would become the first and not the last queen of Numenor, ruling from the year 1075 to 1280. It was also under her rule that the first unofficial permanent settlements were made along the southern coast of Middle-earth, in places such as Pelagia, Bertholas, and Umbar. However, it would be under the rule of the second queen of Numenor that the need for aid that Gil-galad had sent all those years ago would finally come to pass. For under the rule of Tar-Telperion, who ruled from the year 1556 to 1731, in the year 1693 did Sauron declare openly, and he made war upon the elves of Middle-earth, and thus did the war of the elves and Sauron begin. Though it would be her nephew, Tar-Menaster, who answered the call, and he would lead a great host into Middle-earth, fleets of ships and armies, and it is said that the strength and might of Numenor was so great that when the armies of Numenor took to the field, no one could stand against them, and Sauron was beaten in battle after battle after battle, until he retreated to his fortress of Barad-dûr, which eventually would be sieged, with him defeated, retreating back into the east to garner his power. In the year 1731, Tar-Menastir would be declared king, and it was under him that he established the first ever official colonies across the entire coast of Middle-earth. However, after his rule, things would begin to grow dark for the men of Numenor. It is said by some that when the Numenorians realized how powerful they were, it began to eat at them, not with worry, but worse, with imagination, with ideas, with hope, with splendor and grandeur, with ambition, and thus did they seek to grow powerful, yet also they grew resentful, for long had the men gazed upon the lives of the elves. For while the normal Numenorian lived to about 300, with those of Tar-Miniatur's vicinity living up to nearly 500 in some cases, they were not immortal, and thus did they wonder, why did the elves, those such as the Noldor, who had not only betrayed the Valar, but slain their own kin, and yet they were still allowed to go to the Undying Land's true eternal paradise to dwell amongst angels, the Valar? Yet why not them? Why not the men of the Edain, who had never betrayed the Valar, who had fought so brilliantly, and who had stood by them? Why were they denied such glory and beauty? Realizing this and understanding their concerns, the Valar then took unto them counsel, and they explained to them as such. Why do the laws of the West sit there in peace unending, while we must die, and go not where we wither, leaving our home and all that we have made? And since we have mastered the seas, and no water is wild, or so wild that our ships cannot overcome it, why should we not go to Avalone, and greet thee there, our friends? Your people are not of the firstborn, but are mortal men. Yet it seems that you desire now to have the good of both kinds. That cannot be. The Eldar, you say, are unpunishment, yet that is to them neither reward nor punishment, but the fulfillment of their being. They cannot escape and are bound to this world, for its life is theirs, and you are punished, so you say. So it is that you die, but that was not a punishment. Thus you escape and leave this world behind, for you are not bound to it, in hope or in weariness. Which of us, therefore, should envy the other? Why should we not envy the Valar, or even the least of the deathless? For of us is required a blind trust, and a hope without assurance, knowing not what lies before us in even a little while. And yet we have also love of the earth, and would not lose it. This we hold to be true, that your home is not here, neither in the land of Aman, nor anywhere within the circles of the world, and the doom of men, that they should depart, was at first a gift of Eru Ilúvatar. It became a grief to them, only because, coming under the shadow of Morgoth, did it seem to them that they were surrounded by a great darkness. And here from this exchange do we ultimately see the beginning of the downfalls of Numenor. The Númenóreans say, why should we hope in this? How can we be expected to have blind trust? In other words, how can they be expected to have faith? And thus did a split begin. Those who remained in their faith, known as the faithful, and those who wished to follow their king, which became known as the Kingsmen. However, at this point it was much more a difference of lesser beliefs, but it would get far, far worse. As the reign of Tar-Kiryatan progressed, the elves who had long visited Numenor began to stop their visits to what they saw as a hostile people, and it was under him that the blessing of the High Men began to dwindle. For by the reign of his son, Tar-Antanamir, fear had well and truly gripped the hearts of men, for he was the first king to rule unto his death ever since Tar-Miniatur in the year 2221 of the Second Age. The degradation of the High Men would continue, for fear gnawed at men, and with the lessening influence of the Valar and the elves, very few began to remember the goodness that had given them their blessing in the first place. This culminates ultimately with Tar-Kamansil, ruling from the year 2737 to 2825, for he took the title of Ar-Belzegar in his own native Undunic over the Elvish Quenya. This would only get worse, as his grandson Ar-Andunakor chose his Undumic name, which meant Lord of the West, which was a direct insult to Manwë, the king of the Valar and Lord of Angels. Even further, he would then ban the use of Elvish language in court. And finally, it was during the reign of Ar-Gimmelzor from the year 3102 to 3177 that Elvish would be banned outright. And for when he learned that the faithful were still in contact with elves in some secret, he began to persecute them, which then led the vast majority of them to leave to the Númenórean colonies of Pelagia and Belfalas, with the rest being left in Undunier. And what is in my opinion the final nail in the coffin, he was the first king to outright stop the worship of Eru, neglecting the religious pilgrimages to Melentarma, the highest peak of the island, as well as neglecting the white tree of Nimloth. However, like all Dark Knights, there's always the dusk that has a little bit of light. For he had two sons. His eldest, being Tar-Palantir, was like his mother in Zelbeth, who was a member of the faithful, while her second son, Gamalzakad, took after his father and was a kingsman. Tar-Palantir, reigning from 3177 to 3255, tried his best to reverse the corruption and the degradation of his people, by reviving many of the old ways and halting the persecutions of the faithful and the elves. But the king's faction was still the majority, and thus they rebelled against him and sought after his brother. He was, however, still strong enough to hold off a full-scale rebellion and remained in power, but this turnout was said to have placed a sorrow in his soul, as he would retire from public life, gazing out into the waters of the west, searching for a sign that his efforts had paid off. Yet, he would die, and his daughter Meriel was said to be the fourth queen of Numenor. Yet, she lacked support, and the majority of the people were kingsmen. and thus they chose her cousin, Ar-Pharazôn, to be king, where he took her forcefully as his bride. Which was very illegal, mind you, but tradition and goodness were well and truly gone at this point. For at last, in the year of 3255 of the Second Age, we come to the rule of Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, the last king of Numenor. It is shortly after this that Sauron would then declare himself openly yet again, and he would claim many boastful titles, such as Lord of the Earth and King of Men. Ar-Pharazôn, someone who is equally as prideful, if not more so, than Sauron, took a great offense to this, and thus did he muster the armies of Numenor, and took into war upon Mordor. Though no war was to be had, for when the great might of Numenor appeared, all the orcs and easterlings under Sauron abandoned their Dark Lord and fled at the sight of Numenor, for so great and powerful were the high men still. For while their morals had degraded, and their blessing had lessened, their might and strength were still enough to be the mightiest civilization in the world. And Sauron, realizing that through might of arms would he never be able to defeat Numenor, saw in them fear, and as the great deceiver, he saw his opportunity. He then humbled himself below Ar-Pharazôn, and Ar-Pharazôn in his hubris took him as a prisoner back to Numenor, for this was exactly what Sauron wanted. For as Pharazôn began to gloat and provoke and prod at Sauron in his ignominious victory, Sauron would eventually manipulate the foolish king, and it was under him that he would turn from prisoner to advisor, and he would feed lies unto Ar-Pharazôn, telling him of Melkor, the former name of Morgoth, and how this magnificent entity was in fact the true ruler of the world, and that Eru Ilúvatar was simply something made up by the Valar to keep the true men of Numenor down. Ar-Pharazôn, gripped in fear and searching for anything, took to this wholeheartedly, and thus did Sauron build a temple of Melkor right upon Numenor itself. He had many of the faithful executed in blood rituals, and began even further the corruption, having the White Tree of Nimloth burned, though a seedling would be saved by a certain man by the name of Isildur. The persecution of the faithful ramped up tenfold, which caused almost all of them to leave Numenor completely, with the very few that lived in Undunier moving to Enanor, where they would eventually depart. For it is under Amandil, the last lord of Undunier, grandfather of Isildur, was he blessed with foresight, and saw what was coming. Thus did he bade Elendil to gather the faithful aboard the ships, and await to depart. For in the year 3310, Ar-Pharazôn would be nearing old age, and he was close to death, but would claim him in a few decades. It was then that Sauron whispered his final poison, and told him to make war upon the lands of the Valar, and that they held undying, and that if man set upon there, he would not perish, no, but he would live true and mighty. Ar-Pharazôn, in his madness, arrogance, and lack of everything good, agreed to this. Thus did he begin what was known as the Great Armament. It would take 9 years of building of ships, materials, and men, for then, in the year 3319, would Ar-Pharazôn sail with a massive host, large enough and strong enough to conquer a continent. It was also during this time that Amandil, with only 3 of his servants, would set off on a small ship to the land of Valinor to plead with the Valar and Manwë himself. Though we do not ultimately know what happened to the lost lord of Undunier, I like to believe that his penance did bear fruit. For as Ar-Pharazôn landed upon Valinor, Eru Ilúvatar, angered beyond all measure, unleashed a wrath that was second to none. For a great wave swept over the great ships of Ar-Pharazôn and dragged each one of them unto the depths of the sea. Mountains and hills were set to rise up from the earth only to fall upon his great host, as everyone was devoured by the ravenous earth below them. For Numenor itself was swept away by massive waves, as the island paradise was sunk into the depths. But at the same time, a wind stronger than anything anyone had ever seen before or ever seen since struck hard against the ships of Elendil and blew them far away from any destruction that they would land in Middle-earth. So strong was this wind that their masts were broken in two and their sails torn asunder. And thus did the land of Numenor descend into the depths of the sea in forever darkness, much like the Numenorians who had come to call it home. It then later became known as Alakabeth, or Atalante, the Downfallen. However, while the land itself would die, the blessing of the Valar and the men who earned it would live on in the realms in exile, known as Arnor, the Kingdom of the Sun, and Gondor, the Kingdom of the Mountains. For it would be by them that the Dunedain would form, and they would ultimately see their revenge taken upon he who brought down the ultimate end of their once mighty civilization. So that is the history of Numenor. A very brief history, but context is important. Also, if you didn't understand any of the specific terms that I used, don't worry, there'll be someone in the comments who will explain them, because the Lord of the Rings fandom is just like that. But now that you know the history of the Highman, let's find out exactly how the Valar blessed the houses of the Edain. As I mentioned before, the blessing of the Valar was twofold. One was of course Numenor, but the second was an increased lifespan, a vitality, longevity, and wisdom. What that means exactly is that the average Numenorian lived to 300 years old, with those from the descendants of Elros living up to well over 500. In addition to this, the average height of a Numenorian was 7 foot tall, with them reaching, in some cases, well over 8 feet tall, such as Elendil, who was known as Elendil the Tall. They were also stronger with us, with them having more muscle than us as well as them having stronger bones. But moreover than that, the base intellect of your average Numenorian was raised. It is not only an expansion of the base limits of humanity, but rather the base itself. You see, your average human could, let's say, lift about 40 kilograms, but the average Numenorian could lift 70, maybe even 80, and that's the average. So whereas your baseline human maybe could get 500 kilograms, and we're talking like strong men of strong men of strong men, the greatest Numenorians amongst them could easily do 2,000. But not only were the men of Numenor gifted the ability to learn more, they were also gifted tools. For the Valar, as well as the elves, gifted them many beautiful things, mainly in the form of knowledge, scrolls of lore, of understanding, building materials, fruits, crops. In addition to this, they were also given many gifts, such as the Palantiri, the 7 seeing stones, which were handcrafted by Fëanor himself, the same guy who crafted the Silmarils, which is what Morgoth started his second war for. Combine these tools, which are literally from angels in some cases, in addition with the skill ceiling of the men of Numenor, they were able to create and craft a civilization that the world had never seen. Moreover, one often looked aspect was that they were given better morality. They were considered to be the high men, the princely men, the noble men. Each man amongst them was considered to be of good heart, of good nature, of sound reasoning, and of just behavior. I mentioned earlier that Tar Miniatur chose to die, and that's true. One thing that we humans often fear death. It's such a visceral part of our life. Yet, during the first half of Numenor's existence, every single Numenorian king, when he got too old, would either abdicate, spend a few years with his family, and when he felt his body beginning to grow weary, when he felt himself beginning to get old, for example, his organs failing, or his eyesight go, or he began to wobble, when he couldn't live a good normal life, he would simply lay down in his bed and release his life. He chose to die. That was something that is unheard of for normal mortal men, yet it was considered normal practice for the men of Numenor. They were considered to be the best that the world had to offer. And as I mentioned in that earlier exascript, while the Eldar were tied to Middle-earth, the men of Numenor had no such issues. They could live upon this earth and experience its beauty, and when their body finally gave way, they would choose death and ascend into heaven, blessed by Eru Iluvatar, for have their souls dance amongst the stars in the presence of the Almighty. A concept like that to us modern people is anathema in the best of circumstances. But it's because that the Numenorians had this understanding that they were able to apply themselves. They were builders of immaculate excellence. No one could build as strong or as durable as they, nor as beautiful. Think of many of the great places of Middle-earth: the Tower of Orthanc, or Isengard, the Fortress of Helm's Deep, Osgiliath, Minas Ithil, Minas Aranor, which would eventually become Minas Tirith, the Watchtower of Amon Sul, the Seat of Hearing, and the Seat of Seeing. Every single great bit of architecture in Middle-earth was crafted by the Third Age Numenorians. And as to how advanced they were, well, it varies. In Tolkien's earlier versions, because for those who don't know, Mr. Tolkien had various different versions of his stories. They were kind of steampunky a little bit, said to have airships, but that ended up changing as versions became more and more organized. But generally speaking, it's believed that they are said to be in a Renaissance era. Whereas normal Middle-earth is well within the medieval age, the Numenorians were well into the Renaissance, with them said to have ironclad ships, as well as to be able to possess that of gunpowder. And considering we do know for a fact that gunpowder does indeed exist in Middle-earth, it's not a far stretch. Some of their greatest creations were hollow steel bows, which were able to fire arrows a meter long. For those of you who don't know, an arrow a meter long is essentially a small ballista. The average draw strength of a warbow is about 150 to 190-ish pounds, give or take, with that on the higher end being not that common. There are warbows that are far larger, with the largest, to my knowledge, being 250 pounds. It is no exaggeration to say that to be able to launch a meter-long arrow, a warbow would need to generate well over 1,000 pounds. And even then, even if I'm off, it would be at least 500. That is still significantly more powerful than anything we as humans have. The Numenorians were said to be clad in plate armor, and before I get someone commenting, don't be one of those silly people who thinks that Tolkien didn't have plate mail. And it's called plate mail. Mail refers to armor. Chain mail, plate mail, scale mail. In addition to this, they were said to fight in a sort of Roman-like formation. They were said to prefer fighting in loose order with swords and shields, much like the Noldor. Moreover, they had massive ships that were able to bear any weather, being unparalleled sailors, masters of seafarers and mariners, excellent horse breeders able to breed massive stallions of destriers clad in heavy barding, expert farmers and craftsmanship. Every single thing that we have in Middle-earth, Numenor was just a step above it. They even had some early industrialization in them. Imagine it kind of like the Romans a little bit, where they had water-powered mills. Numenor was simply just better. Combined with the fact that in 9 years, the Great Armament was said to be akin to 1,000 isles, aka 1,000 islands, at minimum, that means that we have at least 1,000 ships, with each great ship being able to carry at least 1,000 people. Combine it with the fact that Numenor itself, excluding the countless colonies that it has up and down the coast of Middle-earth, has a canon population of 15 million people, makes Numenor, without a single shred of a doubt, the greatest civilization ever. Not only that, but in terms of science and astrology, they were far above removed, able to chart the stars and navigate, which helped with their seamanship. They were able to figure out how crops worked, seasonal rotations, how to irrigate soil properly, every single advancement that just makes life better for the normal human, the Numenorians had. But the one thing that they did have, that they would eventually lose, the one thing that made them unique, the one thing that gave them everything they had, was their faith. And that then leads us into the story and the legacy of Numenor. I believe that when Mr. Tolkien wrote the tale of Numenor, he was writing a tale of humanity itself, the old generation, the brave generation, having to fight insurmountable odds against great evil, and were thus rewarded for it. They were rewarded on the basis of faith. Faith not only in God, but in themselves, in their fellow man. To do good, to be good, to not give in to fear, to avarice, to greed, to fame. And what we see ends up happening is that while the men of Numenor are upon their island home, and while they content themselves with farming, with science, with arts, with literature, they are happy, they are faithful. But the moment they see war, and they get a taste of power, well, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the men of Numenor began realizing how powerful they were. And just as Eve, taking a bite of the apple and realizing that she was naked, did the men of Numenor now have the knowledge of life and death. For no longer was death something to be embraced. Was it a promise fulfilled? No longer did the men of Numenor lay down and choose to pass. No longer did they give forward to the next generation in hope and in happiness. No longer did they decide that it was their time and that they would go with the grace and nobility of the princely men. Nay, for the men of Numenor would then become those who were greedy, who had avarice pounding in their veins, those who coveted everything. Instead of gracefully giving up their life and advocating for their betters, they instead greedily clung to every last second of life. Cursing the gods, they were eventually dragged into the blessing that Eru had given them. And eventually they would begin hating the elves, those who they'd once sworn fealty to, those who would once stand shoulder to shoulder with them against the great evil. And eventually the Valar, those who had given them their blessing, and ultimately Eru himself, the god who had created them. And like a child turning away from their father, so too did the men of Numenor ultimately lose their way. Tolkien's writing of the men of Numenor, to me, screams humanity. We're given everything, every good thing that we could want. The men of Numenor had no desire that they couldn't fulfill. Everything was there for them. They were content in every aspect. But because they simply feared death, they could not allow themselves to be happy. Instead of understanding that death was a part of it, instead of accepting what the Valar had told them, instead, the men who were 7 foot tall, giant, muscular, who were able to draw bows that could shatter entire lines of men, who had an island home free from all sickness and evil, the men who could not die from poison or being under any illness, these great men who could commune with angels. Simply because they had to die, they decided that they would become envious. For in truth, it wasn't the fact that men had to die, but rather that elves got to live. It was this that drove the men of Numenor. Irrational fear, irrational greed, irrational hatred. But this is what ultimately drives men. Men are fearful. We desire that which we do not have, regardless of whether or not we need it, regardless of whether or not we believe we want it. If we do not have it, it becomes a must. We throw away everything we've ever loved, everything we've ever known, everything we've ever cared about, simply to have the slightest taste of that which is forbidden. The stupidity of man, the utter ignorance of those who would claim to this. Follow your passions, follow your instincts, follow your desires, your passions, your desires, your instincts. Where do they lead you? That is the question. Ar-Pharazôn's passions, his desires, his instincts, they led him to making war upon angels and destroying something that had lasted for thousands of years. Yet, Elendil's led him to founding the kingdoms and exiles, and end up creating the line that would save the Middle-earth. This tale is not simply to say that fear is wrong, that desire is wrong, that passion is wrong. Rather, it's a tale that says unchecked fear, unchecked desire, unchecked passion, that which is left to roam free unrestrained by logic and virtue, that is evil. And that is the true doom of man. Yet, as always, Tolkien gives us hope, or rather, faith. For whereas the men of Numenor fell, the Dunedain, the true descendants of Numenor, still stand. And it is by the grace of the Valar still that their blessing yet endures. For now, in the Fourth Age, they live well over to 200 years old, and under the dynasty of the Telcontar will the true splendor of Numenor be regained. For while its wealth, for while its might, for while its prowess may not yet be regained, the virtue, the science, the character, and the faith, those were the things that make the Edain so strong. Those were the things that made them such a bitter enemy to Morgoth. Those were the things that made them such a potent friend to the Noldor, to all the elves. And that was the thing that the Valar deemed worthy of blessing unto them. So too did Mr. Tolkien hope that humanity would find this blessing. For regardless of how many around us fall, it is up to us to be the faithful, to have faith in not only God, but in our fellow man, that we may all be good men. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the High Men of Numenor. This is indeed the race that fantasy forgot. We have elves, we have dwarves, we have humans, but we don't have any high men. There are some people that try and do something a little different with it here and there in various settings, but there is no race quite like the Numenorians. Distinct, unique, their own separate entity blessed by the gods, literally. And in my opinion, it's something that is sorely lacking from media. Because the Numenorians are what men could be, what we wish ourselves to be, what we want to be. So, why is it that we don't include them? Perhaps it's because some people believe the Numenorian to be purely Tolkien. But if that's the case, why is every elf tall, fair, and noble? Why is every dwarf shocky, stout, stubborn, and loving of diamonds? Why is every man caught in between the wars of good and evil, yet always stands to defend their home? What is this, I wonder? But for me, I have a race of high men in my fantasy, and I urge you to have a race of high men in yours. Because what is more excellent, what is more beautiful, dear friends, what is more rewarding than to see someone reach their full potential? And I cannot see any fuller or greater potential than the high men of Numenor. So, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, that has been Numenor. Back again, back at it, after a little bit of a hiatus. I had to take a little bit of time off. I was out of power for like a week, and then really stressed out about that, so I was like, I'm just going to chill for a bit, but here we are. You've seen a little bit of rebranding, you would have seen the new banner. We're going into all aspects of lore, so Lord of the Rings, Battletech, Warhammer Fantasy, Star Wars, you know, basically whatever I just want to talk about. History hammers on all the things. Yeah, look, there is a lot of stuff coming. I leaned heavily into 40k to build up an audience, and I have that audience now. To my 40k fans, don't worry. There will still be plenty of Warhammer goodness, I promise. But there's also going to be some Lord of the Rings and anything else in between. But regardless, whether you stay for it, whether you only watch one thing, or whatever happens, thank you for being here. And thank you for watching this episode. And a very special thank you to Mr. Thomas Moslons for his continued support as a valued member of this channel. If you guys want to gain access to these videos a full day early, as well as some awesome benefits, or you just want to help out your boy, chuck me $1. It's just $1 to say thank you, brother. I appreciate you. Join the membership down below. Join the Discord, hit up everything. But remember, you don't gotta do this. Only do it if you can afford it. Before you buy me a soda, make sure you got one too. Because how am I supposed to give you a cheers if we don't have both sodas? Come on now. Make sure to click on all the things, get ready for everything. We're back, baby. We're back with a vengeance, back with a bang. And comment down below. What do you guys think about the High Men of Numenor? And what do you guys think about the race of the High Men in particular? This was very much about Numenor, and I may end up making a companion piece to this, talking more about the High Men in kind of like a theory crafting video, give or take. But we'll see how that goes. I may get like another friend involved. But ladies and gentlemen, I have been General Bradley 101. You've been beautiful, awesome, and amazing people. Thank y'all all so very much for watching this video, and I will catch y'all next time. Dismiss, Rangers! And in the year 600...